The snow fell like a curse upon the Montana wilderness, each flake a reminder of winter's merciless grip on the land. Through the swirling white, a solitary figure pressed forward on horseback, her dark cloak whipping in the bitter wind. Margaret. Sullivan pulled the reins tighter, her gloved hands numb despite the leather, her breath forming crystalline clouds that vanished into the storm. She was 3 days late to her own wedding. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter in her coat pocket, now damp and crumpled, bore the careful script of Thomas Brennan, a man she had never met but had agreed to marry, a rancher in Silver Ridge, Montana, seeking a wife through correspondence. Margaret had answered his advertisement not from desperation, but from hope. Hope for a new beginning, far from the suffocating propriety of Boston society, far from the scandal that had driven her westward. But now, lost in a blizzard with her horse stumbling through knee-deep drifts, that hope felt as frozen as her fingertips. The wind howled through the pine trees, bending them nearly double, and Margaret's mare whinnied nervously, steam rising from her flanks. They had been traveling since dawn, following what she believed was the trail to Silver Ridge, but the landmarks mentioned in Thomas's directions had long since disappeared beneath the white shroud. Margaret's stomach clenched with hunger. She had rationed her meager supplies too carefully, not anticipating the delay. Her last piece of hardtack lay somewhere at the bottom of her saddlebag, and the thought of stopping to search for it in this wind seemed impossible. The cold bit through her wool dress, through the layers. She had thought sufficient for the journey. Boston winters had not prepared her for this. Then, through the storm's fury, she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze colder than the mountain air, a child's cry, thin and desperate, carried on the wind like a ghost's wail. Margaret pulled, her horse to a halt, straining to listen above the howling gale. There it was again, weaker now, but unmistakably human. Her mare's ears pricked forward, and the animal turned toward a rocky outcrop barely visible through the snow. Margaret squinted, wiping ice crystals from her eyelashes. The hillside was steep, dotted with boulders, and what appeared to be the dark mouth of a cave. Another cry drifted to her, and this time she was certain. Children, plural, their voices mixing with the wind in a harmony of desperation that cut straight to her heart. Margaret's hands shook as she dismounted, her legs unsteady after hours in the saddle. The snow came up to her knees, soaking through her boots immediately. She tied her horse to a sturdy pine and began climbing toward the cave, each step a battle against the drifts and her own exhaustion. The cave opening yawned before her like a mouth, dark and forbidding. The cries had stopped, leaving only the storm's roar, and for a moment Margaret wondered if her mind had conjured the sounds from her own loneliness and fear. But then, from deep within the rocky hollow, came the softest whimper. She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the oil lamp Thomas had suggested she carry. Her fingers fumbled with the matches, the wind threatening to extinguish each flame before she could light the wick. Finally, blessed light bloomed in the darkness, pushing back the shadows just enough to reveal the cave's interior. What Margaret saw there would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life, and transform her into something she never knew she could become. 5 children huddled together against the far wall of the cave, their arms wrapped around each other in a desperate attempt at warmth. They were thin, no, not just thin, but skeletal, their clothes hanging like rags on frames too frail to support them. Their faces, gaunt and hollow-eyed, turned toward her lamp with expressions that mixed terror and the faintest flicker of hope. The oldest, a boy who couldn't have been more than 12, clutched a smaller child to his chest, a little girl whose lips had taken on the blue tinge of hypothermia. Between them sat 3 other children, their ages impossible to determine through the mask of hunger and cold that had aged them beyond their years. "Sweet mother of mercy," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. The oldest boy, she would later learn his name was Samuel Morrison, tried to stand, but his legs gave out beneath him. His voice came as barely more than a rasp. "Please, don't hurt us. We'll move on. We're not thieves." Margaret set the lamp carefully on a stone ledge and approached slowly, her hands visible and empty. "I'm not going to hurt you, child. My name is Margaret. What are yours?" Samuel's eyes darted between her face and the cave entrance, as if calculating whether she might be followed by men with crueler intentions. "I'm Samuel," he whispered finally. "This is Grace." He indicated the little girl in his arms, who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. "And that's Benjamin, Lucy, and James." Margaret knelt beside them, her heart breaking at the sight. Benjamin appeared to be about 9, his auburn hair matted and dirty. Lucy, perhaps 7, had wrapped her arms around James, who looked to be 5 or 6. All 5 children bore the unmistakable signs of prolonged starvation: sunken cheeks, protruding ribs visible through torn clothing, and that particular listlessness that comes when the body begins consuming itself to survive. "How long have you been here?" Margaret asked gently, already dreading the answer. 3 days, Samuel replied. "Maybe 4. We lost count." "And before that?" Samuel's jaw tightened, a gesture that seemed far too mature for his young face. "Walking, always walking. Since the orphanage burned down in Butte City 6 weeks. Ego." Margaret's blood chilled. She remembered hearing about that fire in one of the newspaper accounts she'd read during her journey west. The Mercy Home for Children had been consumed in a blaze that took the lives of several staff members. She had assumed all the children had been relocated to other institutions. "There were more of us," Samuel continued, his voice growing even quieter. "8 when we started. Tommy got the fever 2 weeks back. Sarah and little Pete." He swallowed hard. "They couldn't keep up when the snow started. We tried to carry them, but—" He didn't need to finish. Margaret understood with horrible clarity. These 5 children were the survivors of an unthinkable ordeal, and they were now facing the same fate as their companions unless something changed immediately. "When did you last eat?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Yesterday," Lucy spoke for the first time, her voice barely audible. "Samuel found some berries under the snow, but they made us sick." Margaret's mind raced. She had some supplies in her saddlebags. Not much, certainly not enough to feed 5 starving children properly, but enough to keep them alive until she could figure out what to do next. The storm showed no signs of abating, and her original plan of reaching Silver Ridge seemed insignificant now compared to the crisis before her. She stood quickly. "I'm going to get some food from my horse. I'll be right back." Samuel's hand shot out, grasping her skirt with surprising strength. You won't leave us?" The fear in his eyes was so raw, so absolute, that Margaret felt her own eyes fill with tears. These children had been abandoned by everyone who should have protected them, first by the fire that destroyed their home, then by whatever system should have ensured their safety, and finally by the adults who should have helped them along their desperate journey. "I give you my solemn word," Margaret said, covering his small hand with hers. "I will not abandon you." She returned to her horse through the driving snow, her mind working furiously as she gathered her meager supplies. She had a small wheel of cheese, half a loaf of bread that had gone stale but was still edible, some dried meat and a tin of crackers. It wasn't nearly enough, but it would have to do for now. Back in the cave, she watched as the children's eyes fixed on the food, with an intensity that spoke of weeks of hunger. But Samuel, despite his own obvious desperation, began dividing the portions equally among his companions, giving himself the smallest share. "Wait," Margaret said gently. "Let me help with that." She had learned something about caring for the starved during her volunteer work at Boston's charity hospitals. These children needed to eat slowly, small amounts at first, or the food could actually harm them. She broke the bread into tiny pieces, soaking them in water from her canteen to make them easier to digest. As she fed them, the children began to speak more freely. Their story emerged in fragments, how they had fled the burning orphanage in panic, how the adults who should have counted them had assumed all the children were accounted for, how they had survived on the kindness of strangers until the weather turned too cold for anyone to risk helping vagrants. "The sheriff in Copper Falls told us we couldn't stay," Benjamin said, his young voice bitter with premature wisdom. "Said we were trouble, and the town didn't have resources for charity cases." "A lady in Millerville gave us bread," Grace whispered, speaking for the first time. "But her husband said we had to go, said we'd bring disease." Margaret listened to each story with growing anger at the adults who had failed these children, but also with growing determination. She had come west seeking a new life, hoping to leave behind the constraints and disappointments of her old one. She had never imagined that new life might involve caring for 5 orphaned children, but as she watched them eat with careful gratitude, sharing each morsel as if it were precious beyond measure, she felt something shifting in her heart. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cave, warmed by the small oil lamp and the body heat of 6 people pressed close together, something else began to grow. It wasn't just warmth. It was the beginning of an unlikely family, formed not by blood or legal document, but by the simple human need to care for one another in the face of an uncaring world. Margaret pulled off her cloak and wrapped it around. The 5 children, who huddled together like puppies seeking warmth. She kept watch through the night, feeding the lamp with precious oil and listening to the wind howl outside. Every hour or so she gave each child a small sip of water and another morsel of food, careful not to overwhelm their shrunken stomachs. As dawn approached and the storm finally began to weaken, Margaret made a decision that would change not just her life, but the lives of 5 children who had given up hope of ever being safe again. She looked at their sleeping faces. Samuel, with his arms still protective around Grace, Benjamin curled against Lucy, James clutching the edge of her cloak. And she knew she couldn't deliver them to another institution that might fail them. Couldn't abandon them to the mercy of adults who had already proven they had none. Thomas Brennan was expecting a wife, but he was going to get much more than he had bargained for. Margaret Sullivan was about to arrive in Silver Ridge, not as a mail-order bride seeking security, but as a woman who had found her true purpose in the most unexpected place, caring for 5 children who needed her more than she had ever needed anything in her life. The sun broke through the clouds as she began preparing for the final stretch of their journey, its light streaming into the cave like a promise. Margaret looked at the children beginning to stir and made a silent vow. Whatever lay ahead in Silver Ridge, whatever challenges awaited them, she would not let these 5 souls down. She had found them in their darkest hour, and she would see them through to something better. The story of how a mail-order bride became a mother to 5 orphans was just beginning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning sun painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink, a deceptive beauty that masked the bitter cold still gripping the Montana wilderness. Margaret had spent the sleepless night planning their next moves, her mind racing through possibilities and problems with equal measure. The children stirred as warmth from the sunlight began to penetrate the cave, their movements slow and careful, bodies still conserving every ounce of energy. "Miss Margaret?" Samuel's voice was stronger than it had been the night before, though still barely above a whisper. Are we really going somewhere safe?" Margaret knelt beside him, checking each child's condition in the morning light. Grace's lips had returned to a more natural color, and the others seemed more alert after their first real rest in weeks. "We're going to Silver Ridge," she said, her voice steady with newfound resolve. "There's a man there expecting me, a rancher, named Thomas Brennan. We're going to see if he's the kind of man who can help 5 children who need a home." The truth was, Margaret had no idea what kind of man Thomas Brennan truly was. Their correspondence had been formal, practical, discussions of ranch life, household duties, mutual expectations. He had seemed decent enough on paper, but would he welcome 5 additional mouths to feed? Would he even allow them on his property? Those were questions she would face when they arrived. For now, her priority was getting these children to safety and warmth. "Can you all travel?" she asked gently. "It's about 6 miles to town, maybe less now that I can see the landmarks." Benjamin struggled to his feet, swaying slightly but determined. "We can make it. We've walked further." "Not in your condition," Margaret said firmly, "and not all of you on foot." She had been thinking about this problem all night. Her mare was strong, but couldn't carry 6 people, especially not for 6 miles through snow. However, she had noticed something during their journey: abandoned lumber and supplies scattered along what appeared to be an old logging trail. If she could fashion some kind of sled or travois, the horse could pull the smaller children while the older ones walked alongside. "Samuel, Benjamin," she said, addressing the 2 oldest boys, "I need your help gathering some materials. We're going to build something to make this journey easier." For the next 2 hours they worked together. In the warming sunshine, Margaret's hands, soft from her privileged Boston upbringing, quickly became raw and blistered as she helped the boys gather fallen branches and salvage rope from old equipment left behind by loggers. Using techniques she vaguely remembered from helping her father build garden trellises, they constructed a makeshift travois, 2 long poles connected by crossbeams and secured with rope. The children watched with growing amazement as Margaret transformed from a refined lady into someone willing to work with her hands, to solve problems through determination rather than delegation. Grace clapped her small hands together when they successfully attached the travois to Margaret's patient mare. "You're like the ladies in Samuel's stories," Lucy said with wonder, "the ones who save people." Margaret felt her cheeks warm with something other than the cold. She had never seen herself as particularly brave or capable, but necessity was revealing strengths she hadn't known she possessed. "What stories does Samuel tell?" she asked, curious about how these children had maintained hope during their ordeal. "Stories about families," Samuel said quietly, his eyes focused on adjusting the rope harness, "about people who take care of each other, who don't give up on each other." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. These children had sustained themselves not just on scraps of food, but on stories of the very thing they had been denied: a loving family. The weight of their trust in her was both terrifying and transformative. The journey to Silver Ridge tested every ounce of Margaret's newfound determination. Grace and James rode on the travois, wrapped in Margaret's cloak and the horse blanket. Lucy walked between Margaret and Samuel, her small hand clasped tightly in Margaret's gloved one. Benjamin, despite his weakness, insisted on helping guide the horse, his young face set with grim determination to prove he could contribute. They moved slowly, stopping frequently to rest and to give the children sips of water and small portions of the remaining food. Margaret found herself telling them about Boston, not the suffocating social restrictions she had fled, but the beautiful parts. The gardens in spring, the library where she had spent countless hours, the ships in the harbor carrying people to new adventures. "Will we see ships in Silver Ridge?" Grace asked from her perch on the travois. "No, sweetheart," Margaret smiled. "Silver Ridge is in the mountains. But there are other beautiful things, wide open spaces where you can run without anyone telling you to be quiet, horses and cattle, and skies so big they make you feel like anything is possible." She wasn't sure if that last part was true, but she wanted it to be. She needed it to be. As they crested a hill, the town of Silver Ridge spread out below them, a collection of wooden buildings arranged along a main street, smoke rising from chimneys, the reassuring signs of civilization and warmth. Margaret's heart pounded as she realized this moment would determine everything. In a few hours, she would meet the man who expected to marry her, and she would learn whether her desperate gamble to save these children had any chance of success. "It's big," Benjamin breathed, staring at the town with wide eyes. To Margaret, Silver Ridge looked small and rough compared to Boston, but she realized these children had lived most of their lives in a single building. Any town would seem vast to them. There are children there?" Lucy asked. "Children who get to stay?" "I hope so," Margaret answered honestly. "I hope there are many children there who are safe and happy." As they descended toward Silver Ridge, Margaret rehearsed various conversations in her mind. How would she explain this situation to Thomas Brennan? How could she make him understand that these children weren't a burden to be tolerated, but human beings deserving of love and security? The first person they encountered was the town's doctor, Henry Caldwell, who was tending to a patient's horse. Outside his clinic, he looked up as their unusual procession approached, a well-dressed woman leading a horse, pulling a makeshift sled with children aboard, other children walking alongside. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, but clearly puzzled by the sight. "Are you folks in need of medical attention?" Margaret's carefully planned speeches evaporated in the face of actual human contact. "These children," she said simply, "they've been traveling for weeks. They need food and warmth and care." Dr. Caldwell's demeanor changed immediately as he took in the children's condition. His trained eye assessed their malnutrition, their exhaustion, their obvious vulnerability. "Bring them inside," he said without hesitation. "All of them. We can sort out the details later." The kindness in his voice made Margaret's eyes fill with tears she'd been holding back for hours. Here was an adult who saw children in need and responded with compassion rather than suspicion. "Martha," Dr. Caldwell called to his wife as they approached the clinic, "we have guests who need immediate attention." Martha Caldwell emerged from the building, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and arms that looked accustomed to hard work. She took one look at the children and began issuing orders like a general preparing for battle. "Henry, stoke the fire in the examination room. I'll heat water for baths and start soup. You," she said, addressing Margaret, "get these children inside before they catch pneumonia." Within minutes, the 5 orphans were wrapped in warm blankets, seated near a roaring fire, while Dr. Caldwell examined each one and Martha ladled hot soup into bowls. Margaret stood to the side, watching the efficient compassion of these strangers and feeling hope bloom in her chest for the first time since finding the children. "They're undernourished but stable," Dr. Caldwell reported quietly to Margaret. "With proper care, they'll recover completely. They're remarkably resilient." "They've been through hell," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "And now they've found an angel," Martha added, looking at Margaret with approval. "Not many people would take on 5 children in the middle of nowhere." Margaret felt unworthy of such praise. "I just couldn't leave them." "That's exactly what makes you an angel, dear," Martha smiled. "Now what's your plan? These children need more than just a night's shelter." Before Margaret could answer, the clinic door opened and a tall man entered, shaking snow from his coat. He had dark hair, touched with early silver at the temples, weathered skin that spoke of years working outdoors, and eyes the color of winter sky. When his gaze fell on Margaret, she knew immediately who he was. "Miss Sullivan." Thomas Brennan's voice was deep, careful, tinged with confusion as he took in the scene. His mail-order bride surrounded by 5 children in various states of recovery. Margaret straightened her shoulders, knowing this moment would determine the fate of 6 lives. "Mr. Brennan," she said formally. "I apologize for my delayed arrival. I encountered some unexpected circumstances on the journey." Thomas's eyes moved from her to the children and back again, his expression unreadable. Margaret held her breath, waiting for his reaction, knowing that everything, her future, the children's safety, the family she had begun to imagine, hung in the balance of his next words. The clinic fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the soft sounds of children eating soup. Even Dr. and Martha Caldwell seemed to sense the gravity of this moment. Thomas Brennan studied the scene before him, his gaze lingering on each child's face before returning to Margaret's. When he finally spoke, his words would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just their lives, but the very heart of Silver Ridge itself. "Miss Sullivan," he said slowly, "I think you and I need to talk." The Silver Ridge Hotel's dining room had never hosted a conversation quite like this one. Thomas Brennan sat across from Margaret Sullivan at a corner table, 2 cups of coffee growing cold between them, while the weight of unspoken questions filled the air. Through the frost-covered window, they could see Dr. Caldwell's clinic, where 5 children were finally receiving the care they desperately needed. Margaret had spent the walk from the clinic to the hotel rehearsing what she would say, but now, faced with Thomas's steady gaze, all her prepared words seemed inadequate. He was not the man she had imagined from his letters. He was younger, perhaps only 32 or 33, with hands that showed recent calluses and eyes that held depth she hadn't expected from their formal correspondence. "The children," Thomas said finally, his voice neither harsh nor welcoming, simply factual. "Where did they come from?" Margaret told him everything: the cave, the storm, the orphanage fire in Butte City, the weeks of wandering that had nearly killed 5 innocent souls. She spoke of Samuel's protective instincts, of Grace's quiet bravery, of how they had shared their meager food with mathematical precision to ensure everyone survived another day. Thomas listened without interruption, occasionally glancing toward the clinic, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Margaret finished, silence settled between them like fresh snow. "You understand," Thomas said slowly, "that our arrangement was for a wife, not a wife and 5 children." Margaret's heart sank, but she kept her voice steady. "I understand that completely, Mr. Brennan. If you cannot accept this situation, I will find another solution. But I will not abandon those children." "Another solution," Thomas repeated, almost to himself. "In Silver Ridge, in the middle of winter, with no resources and no connections." He paused, studying her face. "That's either very brave or very foolish." "Miss Sullivan." "Perhaps both," Margaret admitted, "but some things are more important than practical considerations." For the first time since entering the hotel, Thomas's expression shifted. Something that might have been approval flickered in his eyes. "Tell me about yourself," he said. "Not the things you wrote in your letters. Those were proper and polite. Tell me who you really are." The request caught Margaret off guard. In Boston, she had been defined by her family's expectations, her social obligations, her adherence to rules that seemed designed to make life smaller rather than larger. But in the past 24 hours, she had discovered parts of herself she hadn't known existed. "I was raised to be ornamental," she said honestly, "to pour tea correctly and embroider pillow covers and make conversation about nothing important. I thought that was all I was capable of until yesterday, when I found myself building a sled with my bare hands because 5 children needed me to figure out how to save them." Thomas leaned forward slightly. "What happened in Boston? Your letters mentioned wanting a fresh start, but you never explained what you were starting fresh from." Margaret hesitated. This was the shame she had hoped to leave behind, the scandal that had made her a social pariah among Boston's elite. But if she was asking Thomas to accept 5 orphan children, She owed him the truth about herself as well. "I was engaged," she began, "to a man named Charles Whitmore, from one of Boston's most prominent families. The engagement was arranged by our parents, a merger of social positions rather than a union of hearts. 3 weeks before the wedding, I discovered that Charles was keeping a mistress and had been for over a year." Thomas's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. "When I confronted him," Margaret continued, "he laughed. He said all men of his class had such arrangements, and I would learn to overlook it as his wife. When I broke the engagement publicly, Charles spread rumors that I was mentally unstable, that I had fabricated the entire affair out of jealousy and hysteria, and people believed him." "Society wanted to believe him," Margaret said bitterly. "It was easier than acknowledging that one of their golden sons was not the gentleman he appeared to be. My own parents suggested I had misunderstood what I had, seen that I should reconsider for the good of the family name." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When he spoke again, his voice carried a new respect. "So you chose disgrace over dishonesty." "I chose truth over comfort," Margaret corrected. "Though I admit, when I answered your advertisement, I was thinking more about escaping my old life than building a new one. Until yesterday, I had no idea what I was truly capable of. And now?" Margaret looked toward the clinic where she could see Martha Caldwell moving past the window, probably checking on the children. "Now I know that I would rather build something real with my own hands than inherit something beautiful built on lies." Thomas followed her gaze. "Those children, they're not just a charitable impulse for you." "No," Margaret said firmly. "They're not charity cases. They're remarkable human beings who deserve a chance to grow up safe and loved. Samuel has been caring for the others with more wisdom than many adults show. Grace has endured unspeakable hardship without losing her gentleness. Benjamin and Lucy and James, they've all shown more courage in 6 weeks than I showed in 25 years of comfortable living. You want to keep them." It wasn't a question, and Margaret didn't treat it as one. "I want to give them what every child deserves. A home, an education, the knowledge that someone will fight for them when the world seems determined to grind them down." Thomas stood abruptly and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. Margaret waited, her heart pounding, knowing that his next words would determine whether her impulsive act of compassion would become something more permanent or end in heartbreak. For 6 people who had already suffered too much. "My ranch," Thomas said without turning around, "covers 800 acres of grazing land. The house has 6 bedrooms, most of which haven't been used since I built it 5 years ago. I have 20 head of cattle, 4 horses, and contracts to supply beef to 3 neighboring towns." Margaret wasn't sure where this inventory was leading, but she sensed it was important. "I also have," Thomas continued, "enough savings to weather a bad season, enough credit in town to expand operations if needed, and enough land to support a much larger household than I had originally planned." He turned to face her then, and Margaret saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. "What I don't have," he said quietly, "is any experience raising children. I was an only child, and my parents died in an influenza outbreak when I was 22. I built that big house, thinking someday there would be children's voices filling it, but that was before." He trailed off, but Margaret heard the pain in his unfinished sentence. There had been someone before her, someone who had left him building a family home for a family that never came. "Miss Sullivan, Margaret," Thomas said, using her first name for the first time. "I won't pretend this is what I expected, but I've spent 5 years in that house listening to its emptiness, and I've learned that unexpected doesn't necessarily mean unwelcome." Margaret's heart began to race. "Are you saying I'm saying that if you're willing to take on a ranch, a rancher, and all the hard work that comes with both, then I'm willing to take on 5 children who need what I have to offer. Space, security, and time to heal. Thomas, Margaret whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. I have conditions, he continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. The children will attend school when the weather permits. They'll have chores appropriate to their ages, not as servants but as members of a working household. And they'll understand that this ranch operates on principles of honesty, hard work, and mutual respect. And me? Margaret asked. Thomas moved closer, extending his hand to her. You'll be my partner in all of this, my wife, the children's mother, and the person who helps me figure out how to turn a lonely ranch into a real home. Margaret stood slowly, her legs unsteady with relief and something deeper, gratitude that felt almost like prayer. She placed her hand in his, surprised by the warmth and steadiness of his grip. I should warn you, she said, managing a shaky smile. I know nothing about ranching. I can barely ride a horse. I've never milked a cow. And my experience with children is limited to what I learned in the past day. Then we'll learn together, Thomas replied. All 7 of us. As they shook hands in the Silver Ridge Hotel dining room, Margaret realized that she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. Not just safety or security, but the chance to build something meaningful with her life. She had come west as a mail-order bride seeking escape, but she was becoming something far more important. A mother, a partner, and a woman who could face the future with hope instead of fear. Outside, snow began to fall again, but this time it looked like blessing rather than curse, covering the world in pristine white that promised new beginnings for 7 people who had all, in different ways, been waiting for the chance to start over. The real work was just beginning. The Brennan Ranch sprawled across the valley like a promise kept in timber and stone. As their wagon crested the final hill, Margaret felt her breath catch at the sight of Thomas's home, a 2-story house built from golden pine logs, its wide wraparound porch facing the mountains that rose like cathedral spires against the winter sky. Smoke curled from 2 chimneys and warm light glowed from multiple windows, creating the kind of welcoming scene Margaret had only read about in novels. Beside her on the wagon seat, Thomas guided the horses with practiced ease, his shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't been during their tense conversation at the hotel 2 days earlier. In the wagon bed behind them, the 5 children huddled together under thick wool blankets, their eyes wide as they took in their new surroundings. It's bigger than the orphanage, Benjamin whispered, his voice filled with wonder. Look at all the space. Lucy breathed, staring at the open fields that stretched toward the horizon. There's room to run anywhere. Samuel, ever the protector, scanned the property with more critical eyes. Where are the fences, Mr. Brennan? How do we know where we're allowed to go? Thomas turned slightly to address the boy. The property line runs along that ridge to the north, down to the creek on the east, and follows the tree line to the south. That's about 800 acres of land where you're not only allowed to go, you belong there. The word belong hung in the cold air like a small miracle. Margaret watched Samuel's face transform as the meaning sank in. For children who had spent weeks wandering without permission to exist anywhere, the concept of belonging somewhere seemed almost too wonderful to accept. As they approached the house, a figure emerged from the barn, a weathered man in his 60s, with silver hair and shrewd eyes. He raised his hand in greeting, but Margaret could see him taking careful measure of the unexpected additions to Thomas's household. That's Frank Morrison, Thomas explained quietly to Margaret. He's been my foreman since I started the ranch, lost his own family to cholera 3 years back. He lives in the bunkhouse and pretty much keeps this place running when I can't. Frank Morrison approached the wagon with the cautious gait of a man who had learned not to make assumptions. His gaze swept over the children with professional assessment. Before settling on Margaret, "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat, "Frank Morrison, at your service." "Mr. Morrison," Margaret replied, climbing down from the wagon with as much dignity as she could manage in her travel-worn clothes. "I'm Margaret Sullivan, soon to be Margaret Brennan. These are Samuel, Grace, Benjamin, Lucy, and James." Frank's eyebrows rose slightly at the number of children, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "Children," he acknowledged with a nod. "You folks have had quite a journey, I'd expect." Thomas began unloading their meager belongings while explaining the situation to Frank in low tones. Margaret couldn't hear the entire conversation, but she caught fragments. "Found them in a cave. Orphanage burned down. Nowhere else to go." She watched Frank's weathered face carefully, knowing that his acceptance or rejection of their expanded household could make the difference between success and failure. Ranch work required cooperation, and if the foreman disapproved of having children underfoot, life would become exponentially more difficult. Frank listened without interruption, occasionally glancing at the children who stood in a tight cluster near the wagon, uncertain whether they were welcome to move freely. When Thomas finished explaining, the older man was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying each child with the same attention he might give to evaluating livestock. Finally, he spoke directly to Samuel. "Boy, you ever worked with animals?" Samuel straightened his shoulders. "A little, sir. We helped in the orphanage kitchen garden, and I used to carry water for the milk cow." "And you?" Frank turned to Benjamin. "You look like you might have some strength in those arms once we get some proper food in you." Benjamin nodded eagerly. "I can carry things. I'm stronger than I look." "We'll see about that," Frank said, but there was no harshness in his voice. He looked at the three younger children. "Grace, Lucy, James, you understand that a ranch isn't a playground. There's dangerous machinery, unpredictable animals, and weather that can kill you if you're not careful." Grace stepped forward, her small chin raised with dignity that belied her 4 years. "We know how to be careful, Mr. Morrison. We've been practicing being careful for a very long time." Something in the child's solemn response seemed to reach Frank. His stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I expect you have, little miss. I expect you have." The first challenge came that very evening, during what should have been a simple dinner. Margaret stood in Thomas's kitchen, her kitchen now, staring at the massive cast-iron stove that dominated one wall like a black metal dragon. She had supervised meal preparation in Boston, but she had never actually cooked for 7 people, using equipment she didn't understand. Thomas, recognizing her predicament, quietly showed her how to adjust the dampers and feed wood into the firebox. "The trick is keeping the temperature steady," he explained, his shoulder brushing hers as he demonstrated. "Too hot and everything burns. Too cold and nothing cooks properly." The children sat at the long wooden table, their behavior almost unnaturally good as they waited. Margaret realized they were afraid to make any demands, terrified that one wrong move might get them sent away from this miraculous place of warmth and safety. "Samuel," she said, forcing casualness into her voice, "would you help me set the table? Benjamin, could you and Lucy put wood in the fireplace? Grace and James, I need someone to make sure there's water in all the pitchers." Giving them tasks served multiple purposes. It made them feel useful rather than burdensome. It kept them occupied while she fumbled with unfamiliar cooking techniques. And it began establishing the kind of household routines that would be essential for managing such a large family. As they worked together, Margaret began to understand the magnitude of what they had undertaken. It wasn't just about providing food and shelter for 5 additional people. It was about creating structure, establishing roles, building trust between children who had learned to expect abandonment and adults who were still strangers to them. The meal itself was far from perfect. The biscuits emerged slightly burned, the stew was oversalted, and Margaret had misjudged portions, making enough food for twice their number. But as they sat around the table, Thomas saying a simple grace that thanked God for bringing us all safely together, Margaret felt something she had never experienced in her privileged Boston dining room, the satisfaction of feeding people who truly needed nourishment. After dinner, while Thomas and Frank discussed ranch business on the porch, Margaret began the monumental task of settling 5 children into bedrooms. The house had been built with a large family in mind, but Thomas had been using only a few rooms, and most of the furniture was covered with dust cloths. "Samuel and Benjamin, you'll share this room," she announced, pulling white sheets off twin beds that looked like luxury after weeks of sleeping on cave floors and frozen ground. "Lucy and Grace, this will be yours. James, you get the small room all to yourself." James, at 5 years old, looked overwhelmed by the prospect of sleeping alone. Can I keep my door open?" he asked in a small voice. "Of course you can," Margaret assured him. "We'll keep all the doors open tonight so nobody feels alone." As she helped the children wash and change into the clean clothes Dr. Caldwell's wife had provided, Margaret began to understand the practical challenges that lay ahead. 5 children meant 5 times the laundry, 5 times the mending, 5 different personalities to understand and nurture. Grace needed gentle reassurance, while Benjamin required tasks that let him prove his worth. Samuel carried the weight of responsibility he was too young to bear, while Lucy had learned to make herself invisible to avoid disappointment. James, the youngest, simply needed to remember what it felt like to be a child instead of a survivor. That night, after the children had finally fallen asleep, doors open as promised, hallway lamp left burning for comfort, Margaret sat with Thomas in the main room, both of them staring at the fire and contemplating the enormity of what they had committed to. "Second thoughts?" Thomas asked quietly. Margaret considered the question honestly. Her hands were rough from unaccustomed work, her back ached from lifting children and moving furniture, and she faced a future of challenges she couldn't even imagine yet. But when she thought of Samuel's protective embrace, of his makeshift siblings, of Grace's quiet bravery, of the way all 5 children had said thank you for things as simple as warm beds and full stomachs, she felt something deeper than satisfaction. "No," she said firmly, "no second thoughts, but I'll need to learn quickly. I don't know the first thing about raising children or managing a ranch household." "We'll figure it out together," Thomas replied. "Frank's agreed to help with the boys when they're old enough, teach them ranching skills, give them purpose, and there are other families in Silver Ridge with children. We're not the first people to suddenly find ourselves responsible for more than we planned." Margaret looked around the room that was already beginning to feel like home. Children's voices echoing from upstairs, the smell of wood smoke, and the dinner she had cooked, however imperfectly. The sense of lives intertwining in ways that would create something entirely new. "Thomas," she said softly, "what made you say yes, really? It would have been so much easier to send them to another orphanage." Thomas was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "Because I know what it feels like to be alone. And because that house has been waiting 5 years for the right people to fill it. I just never imagined they would arrive all at once, in the middle of a snowstorm, carried by a woman brave enough to build a sled with her bare hands." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition that sometimes the most important moments in life arrive disguised as disasters. She had thought she was fleeing to a simple arranged marriage, but instead she had found her true calling, building a family that chose each other not from obligation or expectation, but from love and mutual need. Outside, snow continued to fall on the Brennan Ranch, but inside 7 people were learning what it meant to belong somewhere, to matter to someone, and to build something beautiful from the pieces of their separate, broken pasts. The real test of their new family was still to come, but tonight, for the first time in months for some and years for others, everyone in the house fell asleep feeling safe. The first signs of trouble came on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the children had settled into the Brennan Ranch. Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp morning air, when she noticed Mrs. Abigail Thornton approaching from the road. The banker's wife moved with the purposeful stride of someone carrying unpleasant news, her black wool coat buttoned tight against both the cold and whatever distasteful duty had brought her to the ranch. "Mrs. Brennan," she called out, though. Margaret and Thomas had not yet formalized their union. The use of the title felt more like an accusation than a courtesy. Margaret set down the basket of wet clothes and smoothed her work dress, already sensing this conversation would require every ounce of diplomacy she possessed. "Mrs. Thornton, good morning. What brings you out in such cold weather?" Abigail Thornton was a woman who wore her social position like armor, her grey hair. It pulled back so tightly it seemed to lift her eyebrows permanently. She had been the unofficial arbiter of Silver Ridge's moral standards for nearly 20 years, and her approval could make or break a family's standing in the community. "I'm here on behalf of the Ladies' Auxiliary," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of official business. "We've received some concerning reports about the situation here at the ranch." Behind the house, Margaret could hear the children's voices as they helped Frank Morrison with the morning chores. Samuel and Benjamin were learning to milk the cows, their laughter mixing with Frank's patient instructions. Grace and Lucy were gathering eggs, while James scattered feed for the chickens with the seriousness of a much older child. The sounds of their happiness seemed to mock Mrs. Thornton's stern expression. "What kind of concerns?" Margaret asked carefully. Mrs. Thornton glanced toward the barn where the children's voices originated, her lips pursing with disapproval. 5 vagrant children, taken in without proper investigation or documentation. No one knows their backgrounds, their medical histories, or their moral character. They could be carrying diseases or worse, criminal tendencies inherited from whatever undesirable elements produced them. Margaret felt her temper flare, but forced her voice to remain level. "Those children are orphans who survived a tragedy that killed dozens of adults. They've shown nothing but gratitude, good behavior, and remarkable resilience." "So you say," Mrs. Thornton replied icily, "but the community has a right to protect itself. These children should be properly processed through official channels, placed in appropriate institutions where they can receive proper moral instruction and where their impact on decent society can be contained." The word "contained" hit Margaret like a physical blow. She thought of Grace's gentle manner with the animals, of Benjamin's eagerness to prove himself useful, of Samuel's quiet leadership that kept his makeshift family together through impossible circumstances. The idea of containing such remarkable spirits in some cold institution made her stomach turn. "Mrs. Thornton," Margaret said, stepping closer and lowering her voice, "those children have been through enough institutional care. The orphanage they came from burned down. They nearly died wandering the wilderness. They deserve a chance to heal and grow in a real home." "A real home." Mrs. Thornton's eyebrows rose. "You mean the home of a man who imported a stranger as his bride and is now playing house with 5 children of unknown origin?" "Mrs. Brennan, if that's truly your name, yet you seem to misunderstand your position in this community." The threat beneath her words was clear. Margaret was still an outsider, still subject to the community's judgment, still vulnerable to social ostracism that could affect not just her, but Thomas's business relationships and the children's future. Opportunities. Before Margaret could respond, another voice joined the conversation. "Ladies!" Thomas emerged from behind the barn, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes hard as winterstone. "Mrs. Thornton, To what do we owe the pleasure? Mrs. Thornton straightened her shoulders, clearly preferring to address the male head of household. Mr. Brennan, I was explaining to your intended that the community has serious concerns about your recent additions. The Ladies' Auxiliary feels that proper procedures should be followed when it comes to child placement. The proper procedures, Thomas said evenly, would have left 5 children to freeze to death in a cave. I'm satisfied with the procedures we followed. Mrs. Thornton's face flushed with indignation. Mr. Brennan, surely you understand the broader implications. Your ranch supplies beef to half the families in Silver Ridge. If word spreads that you're harboring children of questionable background, it could affect business relationships. People have to think of their own family's safety. Margaret watched Thomas's jaw tighten. She could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing the children's welfare against the practical reality that his ranch depended on community support. A few words from influential families like the Thorntons could dry up his contracts, damage his credit, make it impossible to maintain the operation that supported all 7 of them. Mrs. Thornton, Thomas said carefully, I appreciate the community's concern, but these children are part of my household now, and they'll remain so, even if it costs you your business. The question was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut straight to the heart of his vulnerabilities. The silence stretched between them, while Margaret held her breath. She realized that this moment would define not just their family's immediate future, but whether Silver Ridge would accept their unconventional arrangement or force them into exile. From behind the barn came Samuel's voice, calling to his siblings. Come on, everyone. Frank says we can help with the fence repairs if we finish the milking. The sound of the children's enthusiasm seemed to strengthen Thomas's resolve. Mrs. Thornton, he said quietly, a man's business is only as valuable as the principles it serves. If caring for children who need help costs me some contracts, then I'll find new ones. But I won't sacrifice those children to preserve relationships with people who would see them thrown away like refuse. Mrs. Thornton's face went rigid with shock. She clearly hadn't expected such direct defiance from someone who depended on community goodwill for his livelihood. You're making a mistake, Mr. Brennan, she said coldly, a very serious mistake that will affect more than just yourself. That woman, she gestured dismissively toward Margaret, has filled your head with romantic nonsense about saving waifs and strays. But when the community turns its back on you, when your business fails and you can't provide for any of them, remember that you were warned. She turned to leave, then paused, delivering her final shot. The Ladies' Auxiliary will be discussing this situation at our meeting Thursday evening. We'll be making recommendations to the town council about how to handle irregular family arrangements that might pose a threat to community standards. After she left, Margaret and Thomas stood in silence, watching her retreating figure and contemplating the battle lines that had just been drawn. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Thomas, she said quietly, she could really hurt us, couldn't she? She could try, he replied. The Thorntons have influence, and people in small towns tend to follow social leaders, especially when they're scared or uncertain about something. That afternoon brought more evidence of the community's shifting attitude. When Margaret took Grace and Lucy to the general store for supplies, she noticed the change immediately. Conversation stopped when they entered. Mrs. Henley, the shopkeeper's wife, was coolly polite but no longer chatty. Other customers found reasons to examine merchandise near the front of the store, creating distance between themselves and Margaret's small group. Grace, with the sensitivity of a child who had learned to read adult moods for survival, pressed closer to Margaret's skirt. "Are we in trouble?" she whispered. "No, sweetheart," Margaret replied firmly, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. Some people just need time to understand that families come in many different shapes. But the isolation was real and growing. When Margaret attempted to make conversation with other mothers, they responded with polite but distant pleasantries before quickly excusing themselves. The children noticed too. Lucy commented that the lady at the post office used to smile at her, but now she barely looked up from her ledger. The situation escalated 3 days later when Margaret encountered Reverend Joshua Walsh outside the church. The minister was a man in his 50s, thin and severe, who had built his reputation on fiery sermons about moral purity and social order. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, pointedly using her maiden name, "I've been hoping to speak with you." Margaret straightened her shoulders, prepared for another confrontation. "Reverend Walsh, I understand you're planning to marry Thomas Brennan and establish a household that includes several children of uncertain provenance. The children are orphans who needed help," Margaret said firmly. "Their provenance is that they're human beings deserving of love and care." Reverend Walsh's thin lips pressed together in disapproval. "Mrs. Sullivan, good intentions don't excuse irregular arrangements. Marriage is a sacred institution, not a convenient solution to charitable impulses, and children require proper moral guidance from established, God-fearing families, not experimental households cobbled together from strangers. Those children have more genuine goodness in them than many adults I've met," Margaret replied, her patience wearing thin. "Perhaps," the Reverend conceded coldly, "but goodness without proper moral structure becomes license for sin. These children have been living without appropriate oversight, without proper religious instruction, without the firm hand that shapes character. Now you're proposing to legitimize an irregular situation by calling it marriage." Margaret felt her anger rising, but before she could respond, the Reverend continued, "I've scheduled a special sermon for this Sunday about the dangers of false charity and irregular households. I suggest you and Mr. Brennan attend so you can understand the community's position on these matters." The threat was clear. He intended to use his pulpit to attack their family publicly, to make them a cautionary tale about the dangers of deviating from accepted social norms. In a community where church attendance was both social obligation and business necessity, such public condemnation could be devastating. That evening, as Margaret helped the children with their lessons around the kitchen table, she watched their faces in the lamplight and felt a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. These children had survived abandonment, starvation, and exposure. They had found safety and were beginning to heal. She would not let small-minded prejudice destroy what they were building together. But as she tucked them into bed that night, doors still open, hallway lamps still burning, she couldn't shake the fear that their happiness was more fragile than they realized, and that the forces gathering against them might prove stronger than love and good intentions. Outside, snow began to fall again, and Margaret found herself praying that this storm, unlike the one that had brought them together, wouldn't tear their newfound family apart. The wedding dress had arrived on the Thursday afternoon stagecoach, wrapped in tissue paper and carrying with it the scent of Boston's finest dressmaker shops. Margaret unwrapped it in her bedroom, while Grace and Lucy watched with wide-eyed wonder, their small fingers reaching out to touch the ivory silk and delicate pearl buttons. "It's like a princess dress," Lucy breathed, her voice filled with awe. Margaret had ordered the dress weeks ago, back when she thought she was simply fulfilling a marriage contract with a stranger. Now, as she held it up against herself in the mirror, she realized it represented something far more significant, a declaration of love and commitment that would bind her not just to Thomas, but to 5 children who had become the center of her world. "Mama Margaret," Grace said softly, using the name that had emerged naturally over the past month. "Are you nervous about getting married?" The question caught Margaret off guard, partly because of its innocent directness, and partly because she realized the answer had changed completely since her arrival in Silver Ridge. "A little," she admitted, "but not for the reasons I expected." What reasons? Lucy asked, climbing onto the bed to get a better view of the dress. Margaret sat beside them, gathering her thoughts. How could she explain to two little girls that her nervousness had nothing to do with marrying Thomas, a man who had shown her more kindness and respect in a month than Charles Whitmore had shown in 2 years of engagement? Her anxiety centered entirely on the forces threatening to tear their family apart. "I'm nervous because some people in town don't understand our family," she said carefully. "They think it's strange for so many of us to live together, and they're trying to make us change." Grace's face grew solemn. "Are they going to send us away?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. She pulled both girls close, feeling the fierce protectiveness that had become as natural as breathing. "No one is going to send you away. Your Papa Thomas and I won't let that happen." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret knew the challenges. Facing them were more complex than simple determination could solve. The community pressure had intensified throughout the week, and she could see the strain affecting everyone in the household. Thomas had lost 2 significant beef contracts, with buyers citing concerns about the stability of supply arrangements, in carefully neutral language that fooled no one. Morrison reported gossip in the saloon, suggesting that the Brennan Ranch was harboring children with criminal backgrounds, stories that grew more elaborate with each telling. More troubling were the effects on the children themselves. Samuel had become quieter, more watchful, as if preparing himself for another abandonment. Benjamin threw himself into ranch work with desperate intensity, trying to prove his worth. Even James, the youngest, seemed to sense the tension and had begun wetting his bed again, a regression that broke Margaret's heart. That evening, as Margaret prepared dinner, she found herself working alongside Samuel in the kitchen. At 12, he had appointed himself her assistant in most household tasks, carrying responsibility with the same grim determination that had kept his siblings alive during their darkest weeks. "Samuel," Margaret said gently, "you know you don't have to take care of everyone anymore, right? That's what adults are for." The boy looked up from the potatoes he was peeling, his eyes older than his years. "But what if something happens to you and Papa Thomas? What if the town people make you go away?" Margaret set down her knife and knelt beside him, meeting his worried gaze directly. "Samuel, listen to me very carefully. Do you remember what I promised you in the cave? What were my exact words?" "You said you wouldn't abandon us," he replied quietly. "That's right. And I meant it then, and I mean it now, and I'll mean it every day for the rest of my life. Sometimes keeping promises is hard work, but that doesn't make them less sacred." Samuel nodded, but Margaret could see the fear still lingering in his eyes. These children had learned not to trust adult promises, having been failed too many times by the very people who should have protected them. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. That Friday afternoon, Dr. Henry Caldwell rode out to the ranch with news that would change everything. Margaret met him at the door, immediately concerned by his grave expression. "Doctor, is everything all right? Are the children—" "The children are fine," he assured her quickly. "But I need to speak with you and Thomas immediately. It's about the stories circulating in town." Thomas emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a work rag, and the 3 adults gathered in the kitchen while the children played in the main room. Dr. Caldwell's news was both infuriating and vindicating. "I've been doing some investigating," he began, following up on the children's story about the orphanage fire in Butte City. "I wrote to colleagues there, checked newspaper archives, spoke with territorial authorities." Margaret's heart began to race. Had he discovered something that would validate the community's suspicions? The Morrison orphanage for children did indeed. "Burned down on November 15th, Dr. Caldwell continued. 17 children and 3 staff members died in the fire. The surviving children were supposed to be relocated to institutions in Helena and Missoula, But in the chaos and confusion, several were never accounted for. Thomas leaned forward. Several. At least 8 children vanished during the evacuation. The authorities assumed they had died in the fire, and their bodies were simply never recovered. No one was looking for survivors. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes as she understood the full horror of what the children had endured. They hadn't just been abandoned, they had been presumed dead, erased from official records, forgotten by every adult responsible for their welfare. "There's more," Dr. Caldwell continued. "I also received responses to inquiries about the Morrison family. Samuel, Grace, Benjamin, Lucy, and James were placed in the orphanage after their parents died in a mining accident 3 years ago. Their father was William Morrison, a respected miner and union organizer. Their mother was Sarah Morrison, who taught school before her marriage." Margaret's breath caught. "They come from good people. Better than good," Dr. Caldwell emphasized. William Morrison was known throughout the mining community for his integrity and his efforts to improve working conditions. Sarah Morrison was beloved by every family whose children she taught. "These children don't just deserve our help, they have earned it through the character of their parents and their own remarkable survival." Thomas stood abruptly and began pacing, his anger clearly building. "So while the town gossips have been spinning tales about criminal children and moral corruption, these kids have been honoring the memory of parents who were pillars of their community." "Exactly," Dr. Caldwell nodded. "And I intend to make sure everyone in Silver Ridge knows the truth." That Sunday morning arrived grey and cold, with low clouds threatening snow. Margaret dressed in her wedding gown while the children gathered around her, their faces solemn with the understanding that this day would determine their family's future. "Do we all have to go to church?" Benjamin asked nervously. "What if people are mean to us?" "We go together," Thomas said firmly, entering the room in his best suit. "We're a family, and families face difficult things together." Margaret looked at her reflection one final time, then at the 6 people who had become more precious to her than her own life. "Are we ready?" The walk to the Silver Ridge Community Church felt like the longest journey Margaret had ever taken. The children flanked her and Thomas, their small hands reaching for reassurance, their heads held high despite their nervousness. Frank Morrison, dressed in his Sunday best, walked beside them, a show of solidarity that meant more than words could express. The church was packed, with families filling every pew and additional people standing along the walls. As Margaret's family entered, conversations ceased and heads turned to stare. Margaret could feel the weight of judgment and curiosity, but also something else, a different kind of attention from some community members who seemed to be seeing the children clearly for the first time. Reverend Walsh stood at the pulpit, his prepared sermon about irregular households and false charity clutched in his hands. But before he could begin speaking, Dr. Caldwell rose from his seat near the front of the church. "Reverend Walsh," he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary, "before you deliver your sermon this morning, I believe the community needs to hear some important information about the children who have become the subject of so much speculation." Margaret's heart pounded as Dr. Caldwell walked to the front of the church and turned to face the congregation. This was the moment that would either vindicate their family or destroy it completely. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Caldwell began, "I want to tell you about 5 remarkable children whose story begins not with vagrancy and moral corruption, but with tragedy, courage, and the kind of family values we claim to honor in this community." As he spoke, relating the verified facts about the Morrison children's background, their parents' character, and their incredible survival story, Margaret watched faces in the congregation begin to change. Hostility softened into curiosity, suspicion transformed into sympathy, and prejudice gave way to something that looked remarkably like respect. Samuel sat straighter in the pew, his shoulders losing some of their defensive hunch as he heard his parents honored publicly for the first time since their death. Grace and Lucy pressed close to Margaret, their fear gradually replaced by wonder that adults were finally speaking kindly about them. When Dr. Caldwell finished, the church was utterly silent. Reverend Walsh stood at the pulpit, his prepared condemnation suddenly irrelevant in the face of truth. He looked down at the children, then at Margaret and Thomas, and something in his stern expression shifted. "It appears," he said slowly, "that I may need to revise my sermon for this morning," and in that moment, Margaret knew that their family's fight for acceptance had taken a crucial turn. Truth had proven stronger than prejudice, and love was about to triumph over fear. Reverend Walsh stood frozen at his pulpit, his prepared sermon about moral corruption and irregular households suddenly transformed into meaningless paper in his hands. The silence in the Silver Ridge Community Church stretched like a held breath, every eye moving between Dr. Caldwell's dignified figure at the front and the Morrison children sitting with quiet pride beside Margaret and Thomas. Margaret felt Grace's small hand slip into hers and squeeze tight. Beside them, Samuel straightened his shoulders as if preparing to face whatever came next, with the same courage that had kept his siblings alive through their darkest weeks. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Would the community choose compassion or continue clinging to their prejudices? The first voice to break the silence came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the elderly widow who ran the town's lending library, rose slowly from her seat in the third pew. At 72, she was one of Silver Ridge's most respected residents, a woman whose opinion carried weight precisely because she spoke so rarely in public. "Reverend Walsh," she said, her voice clear despite her age, "I wonder if you might set aside your prepared remarks this morning." The minister looked startled, clearly struggling to regain control of his service. "Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate your concern, but I remember the Morrison mining accident," she continued, her words cutting through his protest. "It made news throughout Montana Territory. William Morrison died trying to save 3 other miners when the number 7 shaft collapsed. Sarah Morrison spent her last months nursing families affected by the cave-in, using her teacher's salary to buy food and medicine for children whose fathers never came home." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she watched Samuel's face transform. For the first time since she'd known him, the boy looked like what he was, a 12-year-old hearing his parents honored by strangers who remembered their goodness. Mrs. Patterson's voice grew stronger as she continued. "These children aren't vagrants or charity cases. They're the orphaned children of heroes, and they've shown heroism themselves by surviving what would have killed most adults." Murmurs began rippling through the congregation, not the hostile whispers that had followed the family for weeks, but something different. Margaret could see faces changing, prejudice giving way to recognition of shared humanity. But the real confrontation was yet to come. From the back of the church, a chair scraped loudly as Mrs. Abigail Thornton rose to her feet. The banker's wife looked around the sanctuary with the cold authority of someone accustomed to commanding social situations. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, her voice carrying clearly, "no one questions the tragedy these children have endured, but tragedy doesn't erase the practical concerns facing our community." Margaret's heart began to pound. Here was the real test. Would Mrs. Thornton's social influence prove stronger than truth and compassion? These children have been living without proper oversight, without adequate moral instruction, without the structured environment that shapes character, Mrs. Thornton continued, her gaze sweeping the congregation to gauge support. "And now we're being asked to accept an irregular household arrangement that violates every principle of proper family structure." Several heads nodded around the church. Margaret could see that Mrs. Thornton's words were finding purchase with some community members who still viewed their unconventional family with suspicion. Thomas started to rise, his jaw set for confrontation, but Margaret placed a gentle hand on his arm. This was her fight too, and she had found her voice during these weeks of caring for 5 remarkable children. "Mrs. Thornton," Margaret said, standing with quiet dignity, "may I ask what you consider proper moral instruction?" The older woman's eyes narrowed at being directly challenged. Respect for authority, adherence to social order, understanding of proper behavior and one's place in the community. "I see," Margaret replied calmly. "And have you observed Samuel, Grace, Benjamin, Lucy, and James during their time in Silver Ridge? Have you seen them show disrespect or poor behavior?" Mrs. Thornton hesitated, clearly realizing she was walking into a trap. "Their public behavior has been adequate, but that doesn't address the fundamental irregularity of—" Mrs. Thornton interrupted another voice, this one belonging to Jake Wilson, the blacksmith whose shop bordered the main street. He was a big man with calloused hands and a reputation for plain speaking that made his opinions carry weight with working families. "I've watched those children every time they come to town," Jake said, standing slowly. "That oldest boy, Samuel, he looks after the younger ones like a father. Never seen children mind their manners better. And when they helped me load supplies last week, they worked harder than boys twice their age." "That's hardly the point," Mrs. Thornton snapped, her composure beginning to crack. "The issue is propriety, not temporary good behavior." Margaret felt a surge of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "Mrs. Thornton, what exactly do you propose? That we send 5 orphan children back into the wilderness? That we separate siblings who have kept each other alive? That we abandon children whose only crime was surviving when the adults responsible for them failed?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Margaret could see Mrs. Thornton struggling to frame her prejudices in moral terms that wouldn't sound heartless. "I propose," Mrs. Thornton said stiffly, "that proper channels be followed. There are institutions designed to handle such situations, trained professionals who, professional failures," Dr. Caldwell interjected sharply. "The proper channels left these children to die. The institutions designed to help them assumed they were dead and stopped looking. If we're discussing moral instruction, Mrs. Thornton, perhaps we should start with the adults who failed in their duty to protect the most vulnerable." Margaret watched the confrontation unfold with growing amazement. The community was divided, but not along the lines she had expected. Working families, people who understood hardship and survival, were aligning with her family. The opposition seemed concentrated among those who prized social position over human compassion. Then Grace did something that changed everything thus far. 4-year-old slipped out of the pew and walked slowly toward Mrs. Thornton. The church fell silent as the tiny girl approached the imposing woman who had become the symbol of their family's opposition. "Mrs. Thornton," Grace said in her clear, sweet voice, "are you angry because we don't have the same kind of family as other people?" Margaret's heart stopped. This was dangerous territory. A small child confronting an adult whose hostility could destroy them. Mrs. Thornton looked down at Grace, clearly uncomfortable with being directly addressed by the object of her moral concern. "Child, I'm not angry. I'm concerned about proper—" "My mama and papa died in the mine," Grace continued, her small voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary. "Samuel took care of us because there wasn't anybody else. We were really scared and really hungry and really cold, but we stayed together because that's what families do." Margaret could see Mrs. Thornton's composure wavering as she looked into Grace's earnest face. "Mama Margaret and Papa Thomas gave us food when we were starving," Grace went on. "They gave us warm beds and clean clothes and hugs when we had bad dreams. They're teaching us to read better and how to take care of animals and that we're worth taking care of." The little girl paused, her head tilted as if genuinely curious. "Don't you think children who were starving should get food?" "Don't," You think children who were cold should get warm beds? The silence that followed Grace's questions was deafening. Margaret could see tears in eyes throughout the congregation. Hardened ranchers, weathered farm wives, even some of the social leaders who had supported Mrs. Thornton were visibly moved. Mrs. Thornton stared down at Grace, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that wouldn't come. Finally, she simply sat down, her face flushed with what might have been shame. Reverend Walsh cleared his throat, his prepared sermon now clearly impossible to deliver. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "this would be an appropriate time for prayer and reflection on the true meaning of Christian charity." But before he could continue, another voice spoke up. Sheriff Martin Creedy, a quiet man who rarely involved himself in social disputes, rose from his seat near the door. "Folks," he said in his measured lawman's drawl, "I've been listening to this discussion with great interest, and I think there's something everyone should know." Margaret felt Thomas tense beside her. What new challenge was emerging? "I received a telegram yesterday from the Territorial Marshal's office," Sheriff Creedy continued. "Seems there's been a territory-wide search for missing children from the Morrison orphanage fire. 5 children specifically: Samuel, Grace, Benjamin, Lucy, and James Morrison." The church held its collective breath. "Territory's offering a $500 reward for information leading to their safe recovery," the sheriff continued. "Now, I could have collected that money weeks ago by reporting their location, but I've been watching this situation, and I've come to a conclusion." He looked directly at Margaret and Thomas. "These children aren't lost anymore. They've been found by people who love them, who've given them what every child deserves. Far as I'm concerned, the search is over, and the children are exactly where they belong." The impact of the sheriff's words rippled through the congregation, like a stone thrown into still water. If law enforcement itself validated their family arrangement, what grounds did the opposition have left? Mrs. Thornton rose abruptly and walked toward the church exit, her social campaign thoroughly defeated. Several families who had supported her looked uncertain, their prejudices undermined by the weight of official approval and community sentiment. As the Thornton faction retreated, something beautiful began to happen. Families throughout the church started approaching the Morrison children, introducing themselves, offering friendship and support. The isolation that had surrounded Margaret's family began dissolving like snow in spring sunshine. Margaret looked around the sanctuary, seeing her children, being welcomed into the community that had once rejected them. Samuel was shaking hands with men who treated him with the respect due to someone who had shepherded his siblings through impossible circumstances. Grace and Lucy were surrounded by other children eager to make friends. Benjamin and James were receiving invitations to play and learn alongside their new neighbors. In the space of one church service, everything had changed. The major confrontation had been won not through force or argument, but through truth, courage, and the simple power of a 4-year-old asking the right questions at the right moment. As they walked home from church that day, Margaret realized that they were no longer strangers fighting for acceptance. They had become the Morrison Brennan family, welcomed and supported by a community that had chosen love over fear, compassion over prejudice. The real work of building their life together was just beginning, but now they would face it surrounded by friends instead of fighting alone against enemies. The morning of Margaret and Thomas's wedding dawned clear and bright, with spring sunshine melting the last patches of winter snow into crystal streams that ran singing down the mountainsides. The Brennan Ranch had transformed overnight from a working homestead into a celebration venue, with neighbors arriving before dawn to help prepare for what had become Silver Ridge's most anticipated social event of the year. Margaret stood at her bedroom window, watching the bustling activity below with a mixture of wonder and gratitude. Where once she had feared community rejection, she now saw families working together to create something beautiful. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson directed the arrangement of wildflower bouquets, her arthritis forgotten in the joy of the occasion. Jake, Wilson and his sons constructed a makeshift altar from pine logs and white fabric, while their wives laid out quilts for seating and strung lanterns between the trees. "Mama Margaret," Grace called from behind her, "Mrs. Caldwell wants to know if you're ready for your hair." Margaret turned to find all 5 children gathered in her doorway, dressed in their finest clothes, new outfits that had arrived as gifts from families throughout Silver Ridge. Samuel wore a proper suit that made him look startlingly grown up, while Benjamin sported suspenders that he kept adjusting with obvious pride. Lucy and Grace were resplendent in matching blue dresses with white collars, and little James had been scrubbed until he gleamed, his hair slicked down with water that was already beginning to curl rebelliously. "You all look absolutely magnificent," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "But before Mrs. Caldwell works her magic on my appearance, I want to talk with all of you about something important." The children arranged themselves on her bed, their faces serious with the understanding that this was a significant moment. Margaret sat among them, her wedding dress spread carefully across a chair nearby. "Today, when I marry Thomas, we're not just becoming husband and wife," she began. "We're making official what we've already become in our hearts, a real family. That means you're not just children I'm caring for temporarily. You're my sons and daughters now and forever." Samuel's eyes filled with tears he tried manfully to hide. Does that mean we can call you Mama instead of Mama Margaret?" "If you'd like to," Margaret replied, pulling him close. "And you can call Thomas Papa without the Thomas if it feels right. We're going to be the Morrison Brennan family, carrying forward the best of what your first parents gave you while building something new together." Benjamin leaned against her shoulder. "Will we really get to stay forever, even when we're grown up?" "This is your home," Margaret said firmly. "When you're grown, you'll make your own choices about where to live and what to do with your lives. But this ranch, this family, will always be here for you. That's what real families do. They give you roots and wings." The conversation was interrupted by Martha Caldwell's gentle knock. "Margaret, dear, are you ready for the transformation?" What followed was an hour of feminine magic, as Martha and several other women worked to transform Margaret from a ranch wife into a bride. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style, with wildflowers woven throughout, her dress fitted to perfection, and her face glowed with happiness that needed no artificial enhancement. "You look like a fairy tale princess," Lucy breathed when the preparations were complete. Margaret examined herself in the mirror and saw not just a bride, but a woman who had found her true calling. The proper Boston lady who had answered a mail order. Bride advertisement seemed like a stranger now. In her place stood someone capable, confident, and deeply loved. Someone who had learned that home wasn't a place you inherited, but something you built with your own hands and heart. The ceremony itself took place in the grove behind the main house, with the entire community of Silver Ridge in attendance. Thomas waited at the makeshift altar, resplendent in his best suit, but somehow diminished by the magnitude of what they were celebrating. This wasn't just a wedding. It was the official birth of a family that had already captured the community's heart. Reverend Walsh, transformed from adversary to advocate, spoke about the mysterious ways that divine providence works through human kindness. "Sometimes," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, "God's greatest miracles wear the disguise of ordinary people doing extraordinary things." But the moment that would be remembered and retold for generations came when Margaret and Thomas exchanged rings. Instead of the traditional private ceremony, they had chosen to include all 5 children in their vows. "Samuel, Grace, Benjamin, Lucy, and James," Margaret said, her voice clear and strong. "I promise to love you, protect you, and guide you as your mother for all the days of my life. I promise to honor the memory of your first parents while helping you build new dreams for your future." Thomas's vow was equally moving. "Children, I promise to provide for you, teach you, and stand by you as your father. This ranch is your inheritance, this family is your security, and my love for you is unconditional and eternal." When Reverend Walsh pronounced them husband and wife, the community erupted in celebration. But Margaret barely heard the cheers and applause because she was surrounded by 5 children, her children, whose faces shone with joy and security they had never expected to feel again. The reception that followed was a testament to how completely the community had embraced their unconventional family. Tables groaned under the weight of contributed dishes, children ran freely between the adults, and music filled the air as Jake Wilson produced a fiddle, and several other men brought instruments from their wagons. Margaret found herself dancing, first with Thomas, then with each of her children, and finally with neighbors who lined up to welcome her officially into Silver Ridge society. The contrast with her former life in Boston couldn't have been more stark. There, social events had been exercises in propriety and status. Here, celebration meant the coming together of people who worked hard, lived honestly, and opened their hearts to those in need. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret noticed something remarkable happening. The children were no longer clinging to her and Thomas for security. Instead, they were running freely with other children, included in games and conversations as if they had lived in Silver Ridge their entire lives. Samuel was deep in conversation with Dr. Caldwell about the possibility of studying medicine someday. Benjamin had attached himself to Frank Morrison, absorbing every word about ranch management and cattle breeding. Grace and Lucy were surrounded by other little girls, giggling over some shared secret. James was being patiently taught to play horseshoes by 3 older boys who treated him like a beloved little brother. "Look at them," Thomas murmured in Margaret's ear as they watched their children flourishing. 6 weeks ago they were starving in a cave. Today they're just children, happy, secure, beloved children. Margaret leaned into her husband's embrace, marveling at how naturally that word had come to feel. "They're not the only ones who've been transformed," she replied. "I came here thinking I was making a practical arrangement to escape my old life. Instead, I found my real life." The celebration continued well into the evening, with families reluctant to end such a joyous occasion. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, lanterns were lit and the music turned to softer melodies suitable for couples dancing under the stars. Margaret danced again with Thomas, their movements easy and natural after weeks of partnership in running the ranch. Around them, other couples swayed to the music while children dozed in their parents' laps, and the older folks told stories by the fire. "Mrs. Brennan," Thomas said softly, using her married name for the first time. "Any regrets about how different this turned out from what you expected?" Margaret looked around at the scene surrounding them, their children sleeping peacefully on quilts nearby, neighbors who had become true friends celebrating their happiness, and the vast Montana sky spreading endlessly overhead, full of stars and possibilities. "Thomas Brennan," she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. "The only thing I regret is that I spent 25 years not knowing that life could be this good." As the evening wound down and families began preparing for the journey back to town, Margaret found herself receiving an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Abigail Thornton approached hesitantly, her usual commanding presence replaced by something that looked remarkably like humility. "Mrs. Brennan," she said quietly, "I wanted to, that is, I feel I owe you an apology." Margaret felt Thomas tense beside her, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm. This was important, not just for Mrs. Thornton, but for the complete healing of community divisions. "Mrs. Thornton, there's no need—" "Please," the older woman interrupted, "there is a need. I let my fear of change make me cruel to children who'd already suffered enough cruelty. I let my concern for propriety blind me to simple human decency. Watching those children today, seeing how they've flourished under your care, I realize that I was defending rules while you were saving lives. Margaret extended her hand to the woman who had once been their greatest adversary. We all want what's best for children, Mrs. Thornton. Sometimes we just disagree about what that looks like. Mrs. Thornton took her hand gratefully. Those children are fortunate to have you. Silver Ridge is fortunate to have your family. As the last wagon disappeared down the moonlit road, Margaret and Thomas stood together on their porch, looking out over the ranch that had become the foundation of their new life. Inside the house, 5 children slept peacefully in beds they knew belonged to them, in rooms they could call their own, surrounded by love that would never abandon them. Tsati, mail-order bride who had arrived in Montana seeking escape, had become a woman who had found her destiny. The rancher who had built a house, hoping someday to fill it with family, had discovered that the best things in life often arrive unexpectedly, carried by storms that initially seem destructive, but ultimately bring exactly what the heart needs. Their transformation was complete, but their story was just beginning. The autumn of 1889 painted the Montana landscape in brilliant golds and crimsons, as if nature herself was celebrating the harvest season at the Morrison Brennan Ranch. Margaret stood on the wraparound porch, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her pregnancy, watching a scene that still filled her with wonder 5 years after that first desperate winter. In the near pasture, Thomas worked alongside Samuel, now 17 and tall as his adoptive father, repairing fence posts with the easy partnership of men who understood each other's strengths. Samuel had grown into someone remarkable, thoughtful, capable, and possessed of a quiet leadership that reminded everyone who knew the family's story of how he had kept his siblings alive during their darkest days. "Mama!" Grace's voice called from the vegetable garden, where the 9-year-old worked with characteristic determination. "The pumpkins are ready for harvest. Should Benjamin bring the wagon?" Margaret smiled at the question. Grace had developed into the family's organizer, the one who ensured everyone remembered their responsibilities while maintaining the gentle heart that had melted Mrs. Thornton's prejudices with innocent questions in church that Sunday 5 years ago. "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret called back. "Ask him to bring the small wagon. We'll save the large one for the apple harvest tomorrow." Benjamin emerged from the barn, his 14-year-old frame showing the solid build of a young man who had found his calling in ranch work. Under Frank Morrison's patient tutelage, he had become an expert with horses and showed such promise that neighboring ranchers often sought his help with difficult animals. The boy who had once feared being thrown away as useless had become indispensable to the operation of 3 different spreads. Lucy, now 12, and showing signs of the beauty her mother Sarah had possessed, appeared around the corner of the house, leading Margaret's newest project, a small class of 6 children from families scattered across the valley. Margaret had started teaching lessons 3 days a week, using the skills she had acquired from her privileged Boston education to ensure that children in isolated ranch families received proper instruction. "Mrs. Brennan," called little Emma. "Walsh." Yes, the Reverend's daughter, who had become one of Lucy's closest friends. "Lucy helped me understand the arithmetic problems, and now I can do them all by myself." Margaret felt the familiar surge of pride that came from watching her. Children flourish in ways that extended far beyond their own family. Lucy had developed into a natural teacher, patient and encouraging with younger students, already talking about someday attending the new teachers' college being established in Helena. The sound of galloping hooves announced the arrival of 10-year-old James, racing home from town with the mail and the weekly newspaper. The youngest Morrison child had grown into an adventurous boy with an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond Silver Ridge. His letters to newspaper editors asking about events in distant places had become so frequent that the postmaster joked about needing a special bag just for James's correspondence. "Mama, Papa," James called, sliding off his horse with practiced ease. "There's a letter from the territorial capital, and Mr. Henderson at the post office says it looks official." Margaret's heart skipped slightly. Official letters could mean many things, and their family's early struggles had left her with a lingering wariness about government attention. But Thomas took the envelope calmly, examining the seal with the steady composure that had made him such an anchor during their challenging early days. "It's from the Territorial Education Commission," he announced, his eyebrows rising as he read. "Margaret, they want to discuss expanding your teaching program into an official school district. Position." The news sparked excited chatter among the children, but Margaret found herself overwhelmed by the magnitude of how far they had all traveled. 5 years ago, she had been a disgraced Boston socialite fleeing scandal. The children had been starving, orphans presumed dead by the authorities. Now she was being offered recognition as an educator, while they had become respected members of a thriving community. That evening, as had become tradition, the family gathered around the large kitchen, table for dinner and the daily sharing of news, accomplishments and plans. But tonight carried special significance. It was the 5th anniversary of the day Margaret had found the children in the cave, though they celebrated it now as the day their real family began. "Samuel," Thomas said, raising his glass of apple cider, "would you like to begin tonight's gratitude sharing?" The 17-year-old looked around the table at his siblings and adoptive parents, his expression serious. "I'm grateful that Mama and Papa chose to see children worth saving instead of problems to be solved," he said quietly. "And I'm grateful that we learned love doesn't depend on sharing blood, it depends on sharing commitment." Grace, now confident in ways that would have seemed impossible during her earliest days with them, spoke next. "I'm grateful for the new baby coming, and for friends who don't remember that we used to be different from everyone else." Benjamin's contribution was practical, as always. "I'm grateful for Frank teaching me about horses, and for the chance to help other families with their animals. It feels good to be needed for what I can do, not pitied for what I can't." Lucy surprised everyone by speaking with unusual emotion. "I'm grateful that I get to help other children learn to read, the way Mama taught me. Sometimes I remember not being able to make sense of letters, and now I can help Emma and the others feel smart instead of stupid." James, predictably, had the most ambitious gratitude. "I'm grateful for letters from everywhere, and for knowing that someday I can go see all the places I read about, but mostly I'm grateful that no matter how far I travel, I'll always have this place to come home to." When it came Margaret's turn, she looked around the table at faces illuminated by lamplight and love, at children who had become remarkable young people, at a husband who had chosen courage over convenience again and again. "I'm grateful," she said softly, "for a blizzard that forced me to take shelter, because it led me to discover that the family I thought I was seeking was actually the family I was meant to create." Thomas's gratitude was simple but profound. "I'm grateful that love multiplied instead of divided when we opened our hearts to more than we had planned." After dinner, while the older children helped with cleanup and homework, Margaret found herself walking through rooms that held 5 years of memories. The parlor where she had taught Samuel to play chess, discovering his strategic mind. The kitchen where Grace had learned to bake bread, filling the house with the scent of rising dough and rising confidence. The back porch where Benjamin had spent countless hours with Frank, absorbing lessons about animal behavior and human character. In the main bedroom, she paused before the framed photograph that held place of honor on the dresser. Dr. Caldwell, had managed to locate a picture of William and Sarah Morrison from the school where Sarah had taught, and it now watched over their children's new life. Margaret often found herself silently reporting to those long-dead parents about their children's accomplishments, as if maintaining a connection across the veil that separated life from death. Thomas found her there, his arms coming around her, in from behind as they looked at the photograph together. "Do you think they would approve of how we've raised their children?" "I think," Margaret replied, leaning back against his solid warmth, "that they would be amazed by who their children have become." Samuel's wisdom, Grace's leadership, Benjamin's skill, Lucy's compassion, James's curiosity, those qualities were always there, but they needed safety and love to flourish. "And what about you?" Thomas asked gently. "Any regrets about the path that brought you here?" Margaret considered the question seriously, as she had many times over the years. Her former life in Boston seemed like something that had happened to someone else. The arranged marriage, the social scandal, the desperate flight to an unknown future. All of it had led to this moment, this family, this deep satisfaction of a life lived with purpose. "The only regret I have," she said finally, "is that I spent 25 years not knowing that this kind of happiness was possible." Outside their bedroom window, the ranch settled into evening quiet. In the bunkhouse, Morrison was probably reading by lamplight, content in his role as honorary grandfather to 5 remarkable young people. In their bedrooms, those young people were finishing homework, planning tomorrow's adventures, or simply falling asleep, secure in the knowledge that they were loved unconditionally. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Montana seeking escape from scandal had become a woman who taught children, carried new life, and anchored a family that had touched an entire community. The 5 orphans who had faced death in a winter cave had become young people with bright futures ahead of them. A future doctor, a rancher, a teacher, an explorer, and a leader whose empathy would change lives wherever she went. In 6 months, there would be a new baby to welcome into the Morrison-Brennan family. A child who would grow up hearing the story of how love could transform the most desperate circumstances into the most beautiful outcomes. That baby would be raised by parents who had learned that the best things in life often arrive in disguise, and surrounded by siblings who understood that families are built not by accident, but by choice. Margaret placed her hand over her growing child and felt the flutter of new life responding to her touch. This baby would never know hunger or abandonment or the fear of having nowhere to belong. This child would grow up surrounded by the kind of love that Margaret and Thomas had learned to give by first giving it to 5 children who had needed it most. The story that had begun with a desperate plea in a winter cave. "Take my children, instead of me. They haven't eaten in 7 days," had become a testament to the transformative power of unexpected love. It was a story that would be told and retold in Silver Ridge for generations. How a mail-order bride and a lonely rancher created a family that changed not just their own lives, but the heart of an entire community, and it was a story that was still being written, day by day, choice by choice, in the love that filled every corner of the ranch house, where 7 people had learned that the most precious things in life cannot be ordered or arranged. They can only be discovered, nurtured, and cherished with grateful hearts. As Margaret and Thomas prepared for bed, they could hear the soft murmur of voices from the children's rooms. Samuel reading to James, Grace, and Lucy whispering about plans for the next day's activities. These were the sounds of a family at peace, of children who had learned to trust in tomorrow because today had taught them they were safe. The blizzard that had brought them together was long past, but its gift remained. A love strong enough to weather any storm, deep enough to transform any life, and enduring enough to pass on to the next generation and beyond. In Montana Territory, in the autumn of 1889, the Morrison-Brennan family settled into sleep. Surrounded by love and looking forward to tomorrow, the autumn of 1889 painted the Montana landscape in brilliant golds and crimsons, as if nature herself was celebrating the harvest season at the Morrison-Brennan Ranch. Margaret stood on the wraparound porch, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her pregnancy, watching a scene that still filled her with wonder 5 years after that first desperate winter. In the near pasture, Thomas worked alongside Samuel, now 17 and tall, as his adoptive father, repairing fence posts with the easy partnership of men who understood each other's strengths. Samuel had grown into someone remarkable, thoughtful, capable, and possessed of a quiet leadership that reminded everyone who knew the family's story of how he had kept his siblings alive during their darkest days. "Mama!" Grace's voice called, from the vegetable garden, where the 9-year-old worked with characteristic determination. "The pumpkins are ready for harvest. Should Benjamin bring the wagon?" Margaret smiled at the question. Grace had developed into the family's organizer, the one who ensured everyone remembered their responsibilities while maintaining the gentle heart that had melted Mrs. Thornton's prejudices with innocent questions in church that Sunday 5 years ago. "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret called back. "Ask him to bring the small wagon. We'll save the large one for the apple harvest tomorrow." Benjamin emerged from the barn, his 14-year-old frame showing the solid build of a young man who had found his calling in ranch work. Under Frank Morrison's patient tutelage, he had become an expert with horses and showed such promise that neighboring ranchers often sought his help with difficult animals. The boy who had once feared being thrown away as useless had become indispensable to the operation of 3 different spreads. Lucy, now 12, and showing signs of the beauty her mother Sarah had possessed, appeared around the corner of the house, leading Margaret's newest project, a small class of 6 children from families scattered across the valley. Margaret had started teaching lessons 3 days a week, using the skills she had acquired from her privileged Boston education to ensure that children in isolated ranch families received proper instruction. "Mrs. Brennan," called little Emma Walsh, yes, the Reverend's daughter, who had become one of Lucy's closest friends. "Lucy helped me understand the arithmetic problems, and now I can do them all by myself." Margaret felt the familiar surge of pride that came from watching her children flourish in ways that extended far beyond their own family. Lucy had developed into a natural teacher, patient and encouraging with younger students, already talking about someday attending the new teachers' college being established in Helena. The sound of galloping hooves announced the arrival of 10-year-old James, racing home from town with the mail and the weekly newspaper. The youngest Morrison child had grown into an adventurous boy with an insatiable curiosity about the world beyond Silver Ridge. His letters to newspaper editors asking about events in distant places had become so frequent that the postmaster joked about needing a special bag just for James's correspondence. "Mama, Papa," James called, sliding off his horse with practiced ease. "There's a letter from the territorial capital, and Mr. Henderson at the post office says it looks official." Margaret's heart skipped slightly. Official letters could mean many things, and their family's early struggles had left her with a lingering wariness about government attention. But Thomas took the envelope calmly, examining the seal with the steady composure that had made him such an anchor during their challenging early days. "It's from the Territorial Education Commission," he announced, his eyebrows rising as he read. "Margaret, they want to discuss expanding your teaching program into an official school district position." The news sparked excited chatter among the children, but Margaret found herself overwhelmed by the magnitude of how far they had all traveled. 5 years ago, she had been a disgraced Boston socialite fleeing scandal. The children had been starving, orphans presumed dead by the authorities. Now She was being offered recognition as an educator, while they had become respected members of a thriving community. That evening, as had become tradition, the family gathered around the large kitchen, table for dinner, and the daily sharing of news, accomplishments, and plans. But tonight carried special significance. It was the 5th anniversary of the day Margaret had found the children in the cave, though they celebrated it now as the day their real family began. "Samuel," Thomas said, raising his glass of apple cider, "would you like to begin tonight's gratitude sharing?" The 17-year-old looked around the table at his siblings and adoptive parents, his expression serious. "I'm grateful that Mama and Papa chose to see children worth saving instead of problems to be solved," he said quietly. "And I'm grateful that we learned love doesn't depend on sharing blood, it depends on sharing commitment." Grace, now confident in ways that would have seemed impossible during her earliest days with them, spoke next. "I'm grateful for the new baby coming, and for friends who don't remember that we used to be different from everyone else." Benjamin's contribution was practical, as always. "I'm grateful for Frank teaching me about horses, and for the chance to help other families with their animals. It feels good to be needed for what I can do, not pitied for what I can't." Lucy surprised everyone by speaking with unusual emotion. "I'm grateful that I get to help other children learn to read, the way Mama taught me. Sometimes I remember not being able to make sense of letters, and now I can help Emma and the others feel smart instead of stupid." James, predictably, had the most ambitious gratitude. "I'm grateful for letters from everywhere, and for knowing that someday I can go see all the places I read about. But mostly I'm grateful that no matter how far I travel, I'll always have this place to come home to." When it came Margaret's turn, she looked around the table at faces illuminated by lamplight and love, at children who had become remarkable young people, at a husband who had chosen courage over convenience again and again. "I'm grateful," she said softly, "for a blizzard that forced me to take shelter because it led me to discover that the family I thought I was seeking was actually the family I was meant to create." Thomas's gratitude was simple but profound. "I'm grateful that love multiplied instead of divided when we opened our hearts to more than we had planned." After dinner, while the older children helped with cleanup and homework, Margaret found herself walking through rooms that held 5 years of memories. The parlor, where she had taught Samuel to play chess, discovering his strategic mind. The kitchen, where Grace had learned to bake bread, filling the house with the scent of rising dough and rising confidence. The back porch, where Benjamin had spent countless hours with Frank, absorbing lessons about animal behavior and human character. In the main bedroom, she paused before the framed photograph that held place of honor on the dresser. Dr. Caldwell had managed to locate a picture of William and Sarah Morrison from the school where Sarah had taught, and it now watched over their children's new life. Margaret often found herself silently reporting to those long-dead parents about their children's accomplishments, as if maintaining a connection across the veil that separated life from death. Thomas found her there, his arms coming around her from behind as they looked at the photograph together. "Do you think they would approve of how we've raised their children?" "I think," Margaret replied, leaning back against his solid warmth, "that they would be amazed by who their children have become." Samuel's wisdom, Grace's leadership, Benjamin's skill, Lucy's compassion, James's curiosity, those qualities were always there, but they needed safety and love to flourish. "And what about you?" Thomas asked gently. "Any regrets about the path that brought you here?" Margaret considered the question seriously, as she had many times over the years. Her former life in Boston seemed like something that had happened to someone else. The arranged marriage, the social scandal, the desperate flight to an unknown future. All of it had led to this moment, this family, this deep satisfaction of A life lived with purpose. "The only regret I have," she said finally, "is that I spent 25 years not knowing that this kind of happiness was possible." Outside their bedroom window, the ranch settled into evening quiet. In the bunkhouse, Frank Morrison was probably reading by lamplight, content in his role as honorary grandfather to 5 remarkable young people. In their bedrooms, those young people were finishing homework, planning tomorrow's adventures, or simply falling asleep secure in the knowledge that they were loved unconditionally. The mail-order bride, who had arrived in Montana seeking escape from scandal, had become a woman who taught children, carried new life, and anchored a family that had touched an entire community. The 5 orphans who had faced death in a winter cave had become young people with bright futures ahead of them. A future doctor, a rancher, a teacher, an explorer, and a leader whose empathy would change lives wherever she went. In 6 months, there would be a new baby to welcome into the Morrison-Brennan family. A child who would grow up hearing the story of how love could transform the most desperate circumstances into the most beautiful outcomes. That baby would be raised by parents who had learned that the best things in life often arrive in disguise, and surrounded by siblings who understood that families are built not by accident, but by choice. Margaret placed her hand over her growing child and felt the flutter of new life responding to her touch. This baby would never know hunger or abandonment or the fear of having nowhere to belong. This child would grow up surrounded by the kind of love that Margaret and Thomas had learned to give by first giving it to 5 children who had needed it most. The story that had begun with a desperate plea in a winter cave, "Take my children instead of me, they haven't eaten in 7 days," had become a testament to the transformative power of unexpected love. It was a story that would be told and retold in Silver Ridge for generations, how a mail-order bride and a lonely rancher created a family that changed not just their own lives, but the heart of an entire community. And it was a story that was still being written, day by day, choice by choice, in the love that filled every corner of the ranch house, where 7 people had learned that the most precious things in life cannot be ordered or arranged. They can only be discovered, nurtured and cherished with grateful hearts. As Margaret and Thomas prepared for bed, they could hear the soft murmur of voices from the children's rooms. Samuel reading to James, Grace and Lucy, whispering about plans for the next day's activities. These were the sounds of a family at peace, of children who had learned to trust in tomorrow because today had taught them they were safe. The blizzard that had brought them together was long past, but its gift remained. A love strong enough to weather any storm, deep enough to transform any life, and enduring enough to pass on to the next generation and beyond. In Montana Territory, in the autumn of 1889, the Morrison-Brennan family settled into sleep, surrounded by love and looking forward to tomorrow. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.